Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and in this particular episode, I'm going to talk about active listening, or you could say proactive listening, either way. The significance of that is when we talk about problem solving between two people, one of the important things, or group, but I'm going to focus on, the relationship part, let's say, is in two partners. The thing that happens when you have a breakdown in communication is there's obviously an upset. People feel like they're not heard, they're not understood, they're not feeling respected. And we want to repair that. So how do you go about that? When you're upset, how do you go about bringing your partner back into the conversation and at least wanting to try to mend the fence? Because we know once we begin the healing process, then things usually relax and we can get on to better things. But the important part about the conversation and how to do it, oftentimes those details get left out of our learning. What we observe oftentimes is maybe not what's happening, meaning you watch people who argue back and forth, and there is this process of hopefully communication that's happening. People cherry pick bits and pieces of conversation and try to come away with some sort of understanding of what they think the problem is. Now, sometimes cooler heads prevail. People go to different corners and they might come back at a different time and try to hash out the details. Some people are very good at that and others struggle at it miserably, because the examples that have been set for them are merely two people just sort of bickering back and forth. They don't really resolve problems. That sort of sweeps things under the rug. And that kind of conversation, I'll just, for lack of a better term, that kind of conversation isn't one that lends itself to very good problem-solving skills. People generally tend to feel hurt, and that hurt doesn't just go away. Sometimes people just stuff it in the corner and they go on about their lives. So yeah, you may see in a day or two they're communicating again, and they may even be happy because they've gotten past the hurt. But that's not very far from the surface, because given another upset, and it could even be about the same thing or something similar, and all of that comes flooding back, and sometimes it's even more of an escalation. So we see some arguments are already front-loaded with some old issues, and it makes it more and more imperative that we go about resolving these things so they don't just get to pile on. And the thing about active listening is I tend to feel like active listening is a problem solving as love is to emotion. And the significance of that is because it's not something that we oftentimes recognize as what's happening. Now, counselors do this, and counselors are like referees. When they get couples together, when they get individuals together and bring them in and say, okay, now we're going to talk about what the problem is, each individual gets to speak their piece. Again, with the counselor there, the counselor is going to direct this so that we stay on track and we stay on task, because people can very easily get off into the weeds of talking about things that don't even really relate to the problem, but it's all of these feelings, and to the person that's speaking, they think it's relevant. but it could be something way out of their past that they're bringing in, and just things are getting triggered. But back to the part of the active listening. When you are listening to someone bare their soul, what you want to be able to do is to keep track of the conversation and then ask some reasonable follow-up questions so that they get the feeling that you really understand what they are feeling. Now, the they is your partner. So let's say it's your turn to listen. Your partner is going to be bearing their soul to you. And what you want to do is you want to get out of your own head. You want to get out of the defense mode, because clearly when we're talking about two people who are trying to solve a problem, each person has their own feelings. They're telling you what they think is happening from their own point of view. And you as the listener might feel like you are being attacked. So this makes active listening very difficult. But what you have to remember as the listener, just because they say it does not make it true. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to get to the place where the person who is speaking can feel that you are listening to them. Because we are now trying to develop some closeness between the two of you. Now, this is very challenging. Like I say, people do this in counseling sessions because counselors can track the conversation, know where things are going, and they have a much better understanding of human behavior. And they've probably done a little bit of conversation with each of you just to get a grasp of your background. One, if you are a person who's very good at debate, or maybe arguing is another word, then you're probably very good at taking a person down in a verbal joust, so to speak. But if you're somebody who's not very confident or very comfortable in those situations, then you tend to go in a corner and hide all of your feelings. So when given the opportunity to speak, everything just comes blurting out, and not just words, but sometimes tears, and it can even really get really loud and boisterous. And this could be, there's a lot of emotion coming out, and these things can be overwhelming really, really fast. So when you get some practice around experiencing this, then you're not taken by surprise as to what the possibilities are. But when you go through the process and you see what happens at the end, then you can see the whys to learning how to listen, learning how to give follow-up questions, and you can manage this yourself. And I think as you get better at it, then it happens, meaning the breakdowns of communication happen less and less, because you know where you are in the process of being able to share your feelings, or where you're at emotionally, or when something is going to bother you. Then you know how to communicate something to your partner, and then you can learn to trust that your partner is going to listen to you, and vice versa. So this works really well, and I've just kind of talked about it in an overview, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more just to be able to break down some of the nuts and bolts of this. And I'm going to encourage you to write this down, take notes, because when you get in the business of trying to do this, when I say business, meaning you're in the process, you and your partner are trying to work out something, sometimes it can be very, very hard to keep all of this stuff up in your head, because if you're new to it and this is different, it's probably a whole different way of trying to solve problems than what most people are used to. Most people are used to the arguing thing. And the arguing is you say enough things to make a person shut down or go away, and you think you've won. Well, a lot of people are raised to think that that's how it's supposed to happen. That's how problem solving happens. Well, I can tell you that's something that a lot of people learn to do. But in the long run, that is not a very healthy way to try to problem solve, because what it creates is it creates animosity. And when people feel emotionally that they have been beat down and not understood and not heard, then the resentment just builds and builds and builds, and it just ricochets all over the room. And then that person leaves, and maybe they have a negative encounter with someone else, and then someone else, and then someone else. So you can see how these things multiply. So I'm going to take a break here, come back, and I'm going to talk about this some more. Stay tuned.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Always on the go, but the day just won't be one without your Hollywood fix. Let Golden State Media Concepts Entertainment Podcast take care of that. Jordan and Keith is Entertainment Tonight meets Access Hollywood.
I'm Jordan. The guy laughing, that's Keith.
Yeah, I'm Keith.
An all-inclusive look of pop culture.
Hello and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and I've entitled this podcast Active Listening because I want to talk about how I want you to be able to do some problem solving. Now, this day and age, we have lots of different ways in which we can capture information. Some people like to record things. I still like to do the old pen and paper or pencil and paper and write things down. And some people are very useful or very creative with their electronic devices and typing things in. But the main purpose here is to be able to give your partner the confidence that you are hearing what they are saying and you're taking notes, because as this conversation goes on, it could be a lot to keep track of. And you want to be able to do follow-up responses to the questions that may be asked of your partner, from your partner, that is, and then clarifying things for yourself so that you understand what's being said. And this works to help give confidence that the love is still there and we're making progress. Because it's not enough just to be sitting across the table and having, idle chit chat about something, because that may not really be nearly enough to solve the problem. It may take the steam out of the situation. We may be able to say, hey, I was upset or something, but are you really problem solving? So that's the critical piece here. This is where we want to jump over the fence and say we are into the problem solving part of this and not just listening to the fact that you were upset the other day. So writing things down or some sort of notation taking is important. Something else I like to emphasize is when you're the person that's speaking and sharing your feelings, I think it's important that you write down the things that you want to say for yourself, because it helps you stay on track, and so that you don't meander too much into talking about a lot of things that may not really be part of this subject or this conversation. And we want to put a time limit on it, because if we give people the floor or the opportunity to talk, I'm sure they can fill the space. And some people maybe not so much. But let's say, just for starters, we'll give each person, say, maybe a minute and a half or 2 minutes to speak, to share what is on their heart. And you, the listener, are there to listen. You can write down things. And after the initial speaking, the listener may want to do some follow-up questions, or at least clarifying questions, so that we're going to begin the problem-solving part of it. And when that has happened, then we reverse the roles. Remember, you get a couple of minutes to speak. The other person is writing things down, and then they get to ask clarifying things. And what this does, and we're going to stay on the same subject here, what this does is we get the opportunity to be heard. And this is so important. And this is the gift that you want to be able to give your partner. And this is different from arguing. What arguing is, and I emphasize this, is, yeah, you may hear the words that someone says, but the moment somebody says something that you don't like, boom, there's a response. There's an attack in return. See, this is not arguing. What this is about is listening to your partner, get clarifying questions or make clarifying conversation, and then vice versa. This type of process helps calm the situation. And the benefit that you get by talking to your partner is, number one, the person you are upset with is actually hearing you out. Not some third party, not some one of your other allies off in the corner. Maybe they're a good listener, but this is really about you and the person you're having the disagreement being able to come to terms with things, and then realizing something else. And this is really another critical piece for partners. You want to give your other person the benefit of the doubt. Don't assume that they're wrong or that they're making up stories or anything like that. Because now you have to be honest and you have to be vulnerable. And that could be a bit of a challenge. But the idea here is you are giving your partner the benefit of the doubt first. So as they explain things, they will explain them to the best of their understanding, the best of their recollection. And there will be an opportunity to work on some of the details and the recall. Now, you're going to have situations in which people are going to look at the same thing and recall things differently. That is human nature. Now, that for some people is a flashpoint because they may feel that there's a critical piece of information that is interpreted differently. And, that's where counselors, being the referee, can usually massage things. And that might be a bit of a challenge for two people who are just starting out in this. But here's the point. When I said give your partner the benefit of the doubt, there is that so that you can be a listener and allow them to explain how they feel. Because you, the listener, will get an opportunity to share your feelings about the same thing. And this is why you want to write things down so that when you come to that point where these stories might intersect and for you the interpretation may cross, it may not be the same, then you want to be able to mention that and say that. And it's quite possible with the discussion, you may both come to an agreement as to, wow, you may have interpreted something a little bit differently. And it says, oh, okay, I can see how I might have seen it a different way. And already you've begun the process of healing. And problem solving oftentimes is just this part of it. It's the sitting down, having the discussion, and possibly filling in the gaps where there may be some important information that gets missed. Just because maybe somebody blinked an eye, maybe somebody looked the other direction. But as you see the process unfold, you will see that there is a lot to it in being able to solve problems yourself. And when you get in the practice of doing this, remember, this is like a bonding exercise because you're going through the vulnerability, you're being honest, your partner has to listen to you, and they're going to, and this is another technique that therapists like to use, is called mirroring. So when you say something, then the other person has to mirror back what you've said and not just reinterpret the words, but really mirror back what's been said. And therein, there's the opportunity at times to ask clarifying questions. But again, when that moment comes. And the reason the mirroring is important is because it gives the speaker the opportunity to feel like they are being heard. Now, these are very, very simple techniques. Counselors do this kind of thing all the time. But people who are not skilled at problem solving, but skilled at arguing, don't ever practice this. What they practice is picking out things that they can use as an attack. And that's counterproductive. We're doing just the opposite. We may be picking things that we're hearing so that we can get clarification, so that we have a better understanding. And remember, through all of this, you are giving each other the benefit of the doubt. Now, here's something that I'm going to speak about when it comes to the word truth. We all have our own truth. We all have our own interpretation of what the truth is. And because of that, we have to learn that when somebody else is speaking, and let's say they may be saying something that may hurt our feelings, it may be hard to listen to, you are there to listen. Their interpretation of it is their interpretation. Just because they say it doesn't make it absolute, all supreme true. And that goes for both people. Look, I'm looking at my time. I'm going to have to take another break here, but I'm going to come back after the break and talk about this some more.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and I've been talking about proactive listening. So, the bottom line, sincerity in and of itself goes a long way to helping someone be open and vulnerable to questions and answers. So, conversations like these, when you're problem solving, are an opportunity to reaffirm that you are not enemies. And I think this is really critically important that you remember this, because when you're problem solving, sometimes you may be really keyed up, and you may have been a person that is used to the arguing sort of thing, meaning beat your partner down or beat the person down and feel like you've won because they've submitted. And as I pointed out earlier, that's not a win. Being able to talk someone into a corner and sort of like it's a boxing match, like it's a sparring match or, a battle of wits, that's not necessarily a win. Oftentimes, those kinds of things happen at your partner's expense. And if you've never understood that before, here's an opportunity to rethink that whole process. Because if you're the person that seems to come out on top all the time, I really happen to wonder how good the quality of the relationships are that you have. Because you may have lots of transitions in relationships. And if someone is committed to you, they've probably taken a lot of heat from you, and out of some sense of obligation and love for the relationship, maybe not so much to you, but to the relationship, they have endured this. And I would implore you to listen to this podcast, try a different technique, and make a change in how you communicate with people. Because learning the battle of wits may be good for the street, as in so that you don't get picked on. But when it comes to communicating with your partner, it is not a very good tactic. And it is not something that works well in a lot of situations. If you yourself are, say, subject to someone else's taunting and teasing, and maybe they're a little more skilled, I don't think you come away feeling like you have been heard. So that's an illustration of where, bigger, badder tends to win out, so to speak. But what I want you to do with these tools is develop a much more intimate understanding relationship with your partner, and you benefit from that wholeheartedly. And it's something that pays off dividends down the road. So I'm just going to leave it at that part. But as like I said, you have to reaffirm in your own mind that you and your partner are not enemies. Remember, giving each other the benefit of the doubt from the beginning, because this is about being honest, not rude or crude, but being honest and tactful at how you speak. And both partners are going to get the opportunity to do that. And remember, neither one of you feels loved or cherished if you're not learning to listen. And like I said, many people make the mistake of arguing instead of talking, as if arguing is really going to win you any points, because that's generally temporary and very one-sided. You see, the conversation and the problem solving benefits both, not just one. And when you think about it, like I say, you're not enemies, you're not adversaries, you're on the same team. This is a different concept for a lot of people. Another thing that I want to emphasize is that sarcasm and condescending comments have no place here, because that undermines everything that we're trying to achieve. And it goes back to that thread about arguing because one person is trying to dominate the other. Now, remember, I've emphasized about how you are not enemies. You are partners. And that could be hard to grasp off the top, but it's something we learn to do over time. And speaking of time, I like when people put a time limit on these exercises, because it can be exhausting. And we can keep it fairly short. Maybe the problem solving should last maybe 7 to 10 minutes, and then go to something that's mutually beneficial, something where we're bonding with our partner, you see, because we're both in this together, and it's a victory to be able to actually come together and want to problem solve. That is something that should be celebrated, and this is an opportunity to do it. Like I say, 7 to 10 minutes of this, and you can imagine when you're speaking, that's quite a long time. So that's long enough to be able to get into the problem, discuss some of the issues, and then take a break, go celebrate something. And if you want to revisit some of the conversation, you're certainly welcome to do that. But you don't want to overwhelm either one of the participants, because that leads back to the frustration and probably the default mode, which is more of the arguing and the conflict and the fighting back and forth. And we're trying to get out of that process into something that's a lot healthier. Again, therapists do this very well. They're good at being referees. They teach both people how to be listeners. And if one or the other partners doesn't do a very thorough job of it, then the therapist can fill that role until both partners are able to do that sufficiently where they can solve problems together. But in the end, what we want is that the participants to be able to walk out of the sessions and have the tools necessary. Like I say, it's important, if you want to write things down, then write things down. That's a good way to stay on task, to keep track of things, because people tend to remember things in their own way. And just like I said, when two people can look at something and come away with different interpretations, that's why it's important to write things down. So when you come back to the part of questioning or asking clarifying questions of the other person, we're using the words that were part of the conversation and not something that may have just popped into our head because it reminded us of something. So it's a bit of a process, but I think it's worth doing, because once you learn to problem solve this way, then you can apply it to pretty much any problem solving thing that you may have. It could be with a coworker, it could be with another child, it could be wherever you feel that there's some conflict and you want to employ something like this to get to the heart of the problem. And Once you're good at this, then you won't need to bring pencil and paper anywhere. You just know the steps, and things tend to calm down. And that's what you want. So you can employ this in so many different ways. Look, my time is about up, but I wanted to say thank you for listening. And you have been listening to John Johnson at the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. And I've been talking about proactive listening.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.